June 19, 1944, 20,000 feet above the Philippine Sea. Lieutenant Junior Grade Alexander Vrasiu squeezed the trigger on his Grumman F6F Hellcat's control stick and felt the aircraft shudder. 6 .50 caliber machine guns, 3 mounted in each wing, roared to life simultaneously. The combined firepower unleashed 4,000 rounds per minute into the sky ahead of him. The Yokosuka D-4Y dive bomber in his sights didn't stand a chance. A 3-second burst sent approximately 200 rounds downrange, 60 rounds per gun. The Japanese aircraft's lightweight aluminum skin, designed for speed and range but offering virtually no protection, disintegrated under the onslaught. The bomber exploded in a fireball that tumbled toward the ocean 4 miles below. Vrasiu had just scored his first kill of the day. 8 minutes later, he would have 6 more. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The weapon that shredded that bomber traced its lineage to the final year of the First World War. John Moses Browning, perhaps America's greatest firearms designer, had been tasked with creating a heavy machine gun capable of penetrating aircraft and light armor. The result was the M1921, a water-cooled 50 caliber machine gun that fired a cartridge measuring 12.7 mm in diameter and 99 mm in length. The 50 BMG cartridge, Browning machine gun, packed devastating power. A single bullet weighed nearly 2 ounces and left the barrel at over 2,800 feet per second. At that velocity, the projectile carried more kinetic energy than most rifle rounds, capable of punching through engine blocks, light armor plate, and aircraft structures with relative ease. But the M1921 was too heavy for aircraft use. It weighed 121 pounds with its water-cooling jacket. In the early 1930s, the design was refined. The water jacket was removed, replaced by a heavy air-cooled barrel. The new version, designated M2HB, weighed 84 pounds, still too heavy for fighters. The breakthrough came with the AN M2 variant. Army-Navy, a joint service designation. Engineers stripped away every unnecessary ounce. The barrel was shortened to 36 inches. The receiver was lightened. The result weighed just 61 pounds, less than half the weight of the original water-cooled version. But weight savings came with a price. The AN M2's rate of fire increased dramatically, between 750 and 850 rounds per minute. The lighter barrel heated faster under sustained fire. Pilots who held the trigger too long risked burning out their gun barrels entirely. The solution was discipline, short bursts, 3 to 4 seconds maximum. Let the barrels cool. Fire again. This became doctrine, drilled into every fighter pilot during training. The 6 guns of a Hellcat, firing in unison for just 3 seconds, could deliver sufficient firepower to destroy any aircraft in the Pacific theater. The Grumman F6F Hellcat had been designed with a simple mission: destroy the Mitsubishi A6M0. By early 1943, 2 years into America's Pacific War, the Zero remained the standard against which all carrier fighters were measured. Fast, maneuverable, long-ranged, it had dominated Pacific skies since Pearl Harbor. But the Zero had been built according to a philosophy that prioritized offensive capability above all else. Chief designer Jiro Horikoshi had been given seemingly impossible specifications by the Imperial Japanese Navy. Maximum speed of 310 miles per hour, climb to nearly 10,000 feet in under 4 minutes. Armament, including 2 20mm cannons. And critically, range sufficient to escort bombers over vast Pacific distances. Meeting those requirements with available engine technology required radical weight reduction. Horikoshi eliminated everything not essential to the specified mission. Armor protection for the pilot? Not mentioned in the specifications, therefore not included. Self-sealing fuel tanks with their heavy rubber bladders? Not required, therefore omitted. The weight saved went into fuel capacity, enabling the Zero's extraordinary range of over 1,600 miles. The fuel tanks themselves were simple aluminum containers, thin-walled, unprotected. When American test pilots examined the captured Akutan Zero in 1942, They were shocked by the tank construction. A single bullet through any fuel tank meant fire, not a small leak that could be managed. Ignition, explosion, catastrophic fire. American pilots reported that Zeros burst into flames from minimal damage. Now the engineering reason was clear. Every Zero pilot flew knowing that a single lucky hit could turn his aircraft into a fireball in seconds. The lightweight construction that made the Zero nimble also made it fatally vulnerable. When Roy Grumman sat down to design the Zero's replacement, he made different choices. The F6F would incorporate armor protection, self-sealing fuel tanks, and rugged construction. The weight penalty would be compensated by overwhelming power. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, generated 2,000 horsepower, more than twice the Zero's output, and for armament, Grumman selected 6 AN/M2 Browning 50 caliber machine guns, 3 in each outer wing panel, 400 rounds per gun, 2,400 rounds total, fed by belts, fired by electrical solenoids when the pilot pressed the trigger. The installation was carefully engineered. The guns were staggered slightly to fit within the wing's internal space. Ammunition boxes sat inboard, feeding belts outward to the guns. Heaters kept the weapons functioning at high altitude, where temperatures dropped far below zero. Cooling airflow from the slipstream prevented overheating during combat. The combined weight of 6 guns, mounting hardware, ammunition, and belts added significant mass to the aircraft, but Grumman's engineers accepted this. Firepower saved pilots, firepower destroyed enemies. The math was simple. Each 50 caliber machine gun fired at approximately 800 rounds per minute when using the aircraft-mounted AN/M2 variant. 800 rounds per minute equals 13.3 rounds per second. Multiply by 6 guns. 80 rounds per second. Nearly 5,000 rounds per minute when all 6 guns fired together. A 3-second burst from a Hellcat delivered approximately 240 rounds downrange. 120 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition, if even a fraction connected with the target, produced devastating results. Consider physics. Each bullet weighed 750 grains, just over 1.5 ounces, traveling at 2,800 feet per second. The kinetic energy of a single projectile exceeded 13,000 foot-pounds. For comparison, a .30-06 rifle round, considered powerful for hunting large game, produced around 2,700 foot-pounds. A burst of 120 rounds delivered 1.6 million foot-pounds of kinetic energy into a space measured in square feet. No aircraft structure could withstand that assault. The aluminum skin of a Zero, already thin for weight savings, offered resistance measured in fractions of a second. The 50 caliber rounds punched through the skin, through internal structure, through fuel tanks, through control runs, through the engine, through the pilot. But the devastation extended beyond simple penetration. When a 50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary round struck an unprotected fuel tank, it did 3 things simultaneously. First, it penetrated, creating a hole through which fuel sprayed. Second, the impact generated sparks from metal-on-metal contact. Third, the incendiary compound in the bullet base ignited on impact. Fuel plus oxygen plus ignition equals fire. Not a small fire that could be extinguished. An explosion that engulfed the aircraft in seconds. The Zero's fuel system, optimized for range and weight reduction, became its fatal flaw when facing heavy machine gun fire. American pilots learned to recognize the pattern. A short burst into a Zero, the aircraft would shudder as rounds impacted. Then, almost instantly, flame would blossom from the fuel tank area. Within 2 seconds, the entire aircraft would be engulfed. The lightweight structure, thin aluminum skin, and unprotected fuel system combined to create what veteran pilots called a flying bomb. Commander David McCampbell, who would become the Navy's highest-scoring ace with 34 victories, described the Hellcats' firepower in blunt terms during a post-war interview. You could shoot up 400 rounds per gun in 40 seconds if you held the trigger down. Of course, you'd burn out the barrels of the guns if you did. We were taught early on to shoot in short bursts, like 3 to 4 seconds, ease up on the trigger, and then let go of another short burst. McCampbell learned this lesson the hard way. During his first combat flight at the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, he burned out his gun barrels by holding the trigger too long. It was graphically displayed to me that the thing to do was not to hold the trigger down too long, so I never burnt out a barrel after that. The tactical doctrine that emerged emphasized ammunition discipline. 400 rounds per gun sounds like substantial ammunition, but at 800 rounds per minute, a pilot could exhaust his entire ammunition load in 30 seconds of sustained fire. 30 seconds. Then he was flying an expensive glider with no offensive capability. Short bursts forced accuracy. A pilot had to get close, line up the closing, shot carefully, and fire precisely. Spray and pray tactics wasted ammunition and achieved nothing, but a well-aimed 3-second burst, properly delivered, could destroy any aircraft in the Japanese inventory. The contrast with Japanese armament was stark. The Zero carried 2 Type 99 20mm cannons in the wings and 2 Type 97 7.7mm machine guns firing through the propeller arc. The 20mm cannons were powerful weapons, each shell carrying a substantial explosive charge, but each gun carried only 60 rounds. 60 rounds! At a rate of fire of 500 rounds per minute, a Zero pilot could exhaust his cannon ammunition in just over 7 seconds of sustained fire. Japanese pilots were trained to close to extreme range, 200 feet or less, before firing their cannons. At that distance, even their relatively low-velocity shells had reasonable accuracy, but getting to 200 feet against a Hellcat required surviving the approach. And American pilots learned to open fire at 600 feet or beyond, using their superior firepower and higher velocity ammunition to destroy the enemy before he could bring his weapons to bear. The 7.7mm machine guns were largely ineffective against American fighters. The small caliber rounds lacked the kinetic energy to penetrate armor plate or self-sealing fuel tanks. A burst of 7.7mm fire might damage control surfaces or punch holes in the skin, but rarely achieved catastrophic damage against a Hellcat. The American fighter could absorb dozens of hits from small-caliber weapons and continue fighting, but when the Zero's cannons were exhausted, the Japanese pilot was left with only the machine guns. Against a Hellcat, this was effectively disarmament. The American pilot could continue engaging with his 650 caliber weapons, while the Zero pilot was reduced to ineffective small arms fire. By mid-1943, when the F6F entered combat in large numbers, American fighter pilots had developed sophisticated tactical doctrine for engaging Zeros. Never turn with a Zero at low speed. Maintain energy advantage through altitude and speed. Use diving attacks to negate the Zero's maneuverability advantage. And when guns were on target, fire a disciplined burst and immediately maneuver to maintain advantage. The Hellcats 650s enabled this doctrine. A pilot diving on a Zero from above had perhaps 2 to 3 seconds when his guns would be on target before he needed to pull out of the dive to avoid overshooting. 3 seconds. Exactly the length of a proper burst. 80 rounds per second times 3 seconds equals 240 rounds of 50 caliber firepower delivered into the target. Zero pilots described it in post-war interviews as fighting in a thunderstorm. One moment the sky was clear. The next moment, the air around them was filled with visible tracers, every 5th round loaded, with a pyrotechnic compound that burned bright red. The tracers allowed pilots to see where their bullets were going, to walk their fire onto target. But the tracers also created a psychological effect on the target. Seeing 4 bright red streams of fire converging on your aircraft was terrifying. Knowing that for every visible tracer, 4 invisible armor-piercing rounds were also arriving was worse. And knowing that your aircraft offered no protection, that a single round through the fuel tank meant death, was paralyzing. Many Japanese pilots, when they saw the tracers converging, simply froze. The human brain, confronted with overwhelming stimulus, can shut down. By the time the pilot reacted, recovered, attempted evasive maneuvers, the 3-second burst had already struck home. The fire had already started. The aircraft was already doomed. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot on June 19th and 20th, 1944, demonstrated the Hellcats' firepower on a scale never before seen in aerial combat. Vice Admiral Jizaburo Ozawa launched 4 massive strikes from his carrier fleet against the American invasion force off Saipan. 4 waves totaling over 300 aircraft, Zeros, dive bombers, torpedo planes. Admiral Mark Mitcher's Task Force 58 put up a defensive fighter screen of nearly 500 F6F Hellcats. The fighters were directed by radar-equipped fighter director officers who calmly positioned the Hellcats at optimal altitude, speed, and range to intercept each Japanese wave. The result was slaughter. American pilots called it a turkey shoot. Inexperienced Japanese pilots, many with less than 100 hours of flight time, flew into a killing field. The Hellcats, flown by veterans with hundreds of combat hours, positioned themselves perfectly, dove from altitude advantage, and opened fire at 600 feet or beyond. 3-second bursts. Japanese aircraft exploded, caught fire, disintegrated, fell into the sea burning. The American pilots were methodical, professional, and lethal. No wasted ammunition, no dramatic aerobatics, just efficient killing delivered by 6 50-caliber machine guns per aircraft. Lieutenant Vrasiu's performance that day exemplified the Hellcats' capability. After shooting down 6 Japanese dive bombers in 8 minutes, he returned to USS Lexington. The maintenance crew examined his aircraft and made a remarkable discovery. Vrasiu had fired only 360 rounds during the entire engagement. 60 rounds per kill, averaging 10 rounds per gun per aircraft destroyed. This efficiency was not luck. It was the result of careful training, perfect positioning, disciplined fire control, and overwhelming firepower. Vrasiu had closed to optimal range, lined up each shot carefully, fired a short burst, and moved to the next target. His 50-caliber rounds had done exactly what they were designed to do: penetrate, ignite, destroy. By the end of the 2-day battle, American Hellcat pilots claimed over 380 aerial victories. The actual number was likely slightly lower due to overclaiming, common in the chaos of aerial combat when multiple pilots might shoot at the same target. But even conservative estimates put Japanese losses at over 300 aircraft, against 29 American fighters lost in combat. The kill ratio exceeded 10-1. Some analyses put it as high as 13-1. No aerial battle in history had produced such one-sided results. The firepower advantage was decisive. 6 50-caliber machine guns versus 2 20mm cannons with limited ammunition. Armored, protected American pilots versus unprotected Japanese pilots. Industrial might versus declining capability. But beyond the raw statistics lay a more profound truth. The philosophy that created the Zero, prioritizing offensive capability and range over protection and sustainability, had been decisively defeated by the philosophy that created the Hellcat, prioritizing pilot survival and overwhelming firepower. Japanese aircraft designers had bet on a short war. They assumed pilot quality would remain high. They believed their lightweight, long-ranged fighters would dominate through superior maneuverability. They were wrong on all counts. The war lasted 4 years. Pilot quality declined catastrophically as experienced aviators died and could not be replaced quickly enough. And maneuverability meant nothing when American fighters refused to fight on Japanese terms, instead using altitude, speed, and firepower to dictate the terms of engagement. Every design decision has consequences. Choose lightweight construction, pay in vulnerability. Choose unprotected fuel tanks, pay in pilots lost to fire. Choose limited ammunition capacity, pay in combat effectiveness when the cannons run dry. The Hellcat made different choices. Choose heavy armor, pay in weight but gain in pilot survival. Choose self-sealing fuel tanks, pay in complexity but gain in combat persistence. Choose 6 heavy machine guns with abundant ammunition, pay in installation complexity but gain overwhelming firepower. The Pacific Air War from mid-1943 onward became a systematic demonstration of which philosophy worked and which failed. Month after month, the Hellcats shredded Japanese air power, not through individual pilot heroics, though there were many, not through dramatic dogfights, though those occurred, but through systematic, professional application of superior firepower against an enemy who could not survive even a short burst of 50 caliber fire. The Zero, magnificent in 1941, was obsolete by 1943, not because the aircraft itself had changed, but because the nature of aerial combat had evolved beyond its capability to adapt. The era of the lightweight, unprotected fighter engaging in traditional dogfights was over. The new era belonged to armored, powerful, heavily armed fighters that could absorb punishment and deliver overwhelming firepower. And at the center of that evolution sat 6 A&M, 2 Browning 50 caliber machine guns, carefully mounted in the wings of a Grumman Hellcat, ready to deliver death in 3-second bursts that no Japanese pilot ever expected to be so devastating. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots who survived encounters with Hellcats was profound. Post-war interrogations revealed that by mid-1944, experienced Japanese aviators approached combat with American fighters with dread rather than confidence. One captured naval aviator described the experience of being attacked by a Hellcat as like standing in a thunderstorm, the air suddenly filled with visible tracers converging from multiple directions. The tracer rounds, loaded at a ratio of 1 in every 5 bullets, served dual purposes. For American pilots, they provided visible proof of where bullets were going, allowing real-time adjustment of aim. A pilot could walk his fire across a target, seeing the red streams converge until they intersected with the enemy aircraft. But for Japanese pilots, those red streams represented terror made visible. Each tracer meant 4 more invisible, armor-piercing rounds were arriving in the same space. Japanese training doctrine emphasized aggressive offensive action. Pilots were taught to close with the enemy, to use their aircraft's superior maneuverability at close range. But closing with a Hellcat meant flying into a wall of 50 caliber fire that started at 600 feet, continued through 400 feet, and intensified as range decreased. The mathematics was brutal. At 400 feet, even moderately skilled American pilots achieved hit probabilities of 30 to 40%. That meant 240 rounds fired in a 3-second burst, perhaps 70 to 100 connected with the target. 70 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition striking a zero meant structural failure. The thin aluminum skin offered no resistance. Rounds punched through the fuselage, through control surfaces, through the engine cowling. More critically, they punched through the unprotected fuel tanks. The incendiary compounds in the armor-piercing incendiary rounds ignited on impact. Fuel vapor plus ignition source equals explosion. American pilots learned to aim for specific vulnerable points. McCampbell's own words captured this tactical evolution. In his oral history, he stated explicitly that American pilots had learned early that hitting Japanese aircraft in the wings, particularly near the wing roots where fuel tanks were located, would cause them to explode immediately. So Hellcat pilots stopped aiming for the engine or the cockpit. They aimed for the wings, and it worked with devastating effectiveness. The difference in pilot protection philosophy extended beyond armor and fuel tanks. It encompassed training, replacement pipelines, and strategic thinking. By mid-1944, the American pilot sitting in a Hellcat cockpit had likely completed over 300 hours of flight training before ever seeing combat. He had practiced gunnery against towed targets until his accuracy was acceptable. He had flown formation drills until tactical maneuvers became instinctive. He had been taught energy fighting principles, boom and zoom tactics, and defensive weaving. The Japanese pilot facing him might have 150 hours of total flight time. Training had been compressed due to fuel shortages, instructor shortages, and time pressure. Gunnery training was minimal. Tactical training was abbreviated. The experienced veterans who might have taught these replacement pilots were dead, shot down over the Solomons or the Marshalls or the Marianas. The industrial disparity compounded the problem. In 1944 alone, American factories produced over 58,000 combat aircraft. Training schools graduated thousands of qualified pilots. The replacement pipeline could absorb losses and continue expanding. Japanese factories, by contrast, produced fewer than 25,000 aircraft in the same period, and they could not train pilots fast enough to crew them. Every American pilot knew that if he was shot down but survived, the Combat Air Patrol would vector rescue submarines or seaplanes to his position. The Navy invested enormous resources in rescuing downed aviators. Submarines patrolled near combat zones specifically to recover pilots. This knowledge affected pilot behavior. A pilot who knew rescue was probable, fought with more confidence, took calculated risks, and did not panic if damaged. Japanese pilots had no such assurance. Naval combat doctrine emphasized that the pilot sacrificed himself for the emperor if necessary. Rescue operations were secondary to mission completion. This created a psychological burden. Every mission might be your last. Every engagement might end in death. That knowledge produced either reckless aggression or hesitant caution, neither of which helped survival. October 24, 1944. The Philippine Sea, 120 miles east of Luzon. Commander David McCampbell sat in the cockpit of his F6F5 Hellcat, call sign Mincy 3, on the flight deck of USS Essex. The morning strike was being prepared. Dive bombers, torpedo planes, and fighter escorts were being spotted on deck, armed, fueled, and readied for launch. Then the radar operators in the Combat Information Center detected a large formation of incoming Japanese aircraft. Multiple bogies, big raid, coming fast. The strike launch was suspended. The deck was cleared for fighter launch. McCampbell's aircraft had been only partially fueled when the alarm sounded. There wasn't time to complete the fueling process. Launch immediately, or lose the altitude advantage. McCampbell and his wingman, Ensign Roy Rushing, launched with fuel tanks reading less than half full. They climbed hard, trading fuel for altitude, positioning themselves above the expected intercept point. At 25,000 feet, they spotted the enemy formation below them. Approximately 60 aircraft, bombers in the center, fighters providing escort. The main American fighter group was engaging the formation, but multiple Japanese aircraft were breaking through toward the task force. McCampbell assessed the tactical situation in seconds. He and Rushing were positioned perfectly. Altitude advantage, sun at their backs. The enemy below them was focused on the main engagement and hadn't detected two Hellcats above them. This was the textbook setup for boom and zoom attacks. McCampbell dove. Rushing followed, maintaining position as briefed. They hit the formation at high speed, selecting targets carefully. McCampbell lined up a Nakajima Ki 43 Oscar fighter, closed to 400 feet, and fired a 3-second burst. The Oscar exploded. Rushing simultaneously destroyed a Zero. The two Hellcats zoomed back to altitude, using their diving speed as energy, setting up for another attack. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The engagement continued for over 90 minutes. 20 coordinated attacks. Each attack followed the same pattern. Dive from altitude. Select target. Close to firing range. 3-second burst. Zoom back to altitude. Reset. Repeat. The discipline required was extraordinary. Every instinct screamed to stay in the fight, to turn and engage, to chase damaged aircraft. But McCampbell and Rushing maintained their tactical discipline. They never got slow, never tried to turn with the enemy, never deviated from energy fighting principles. McCampbell's gunnery was precise. He had learned through experience exactly how much lead to give a target at various angles and speeds. His 3-second bursts were timed perfectly. Fire, see the tracers, converge. See the hits register, see the fire start, disengage. Each attack took approximately 30 seconds from initial dive to zoom recovery. 20 attacks, 10 minutes of actual combat, spread over 90 minutes of positioning, diving, and climbing. Rushing's recognition skills were exceptional. In the chaos of aerial combat, with dozens of aircraft maneuvering violently, correct identification was critical. Rushing called out aircraft types as they selected targets. Zero, Oscar, Hamp, which was a variant of the Zero. McCampbell trusted his wingman's identification completely. Together, they destroyed 15 Japanese aircraft. McCampbell scored 9 kills, Rushing 6. The ammunition expenditure revealed the effectiveness of Hellcat firepower combined with skilled gunnery. McCampbell's Hellcat carried 400 rounds per gun, 2,400 total. After landing, maintenance crews counted the remaining ammunition. 6 rounds remained. 6 bullets. Out of 24, 200. He had expended 2,394 rounds to destroy 9 aircraft. That averaged 266 rounds per kill, or approximately 1 3-second burst per aircraft destroyed, with some rounds expended on targets that were not confirmed kills or probables. The fuel situation was desperate. As McCampbell turned toward Essex for landing, his fuel gauges read empty. The engine was running on fumes remaining in the fuel lines. Essex's flight deck was fouled, aircraft still landing from the strike mission. McCampbell diverted to USS Langley, a light carrier nearby. He lined up for approach, dropped his tailhook, and crossed the carrier's stern at landing speed. His Hellcat caught the arresting wire. The aircraft jerked to a stop on the deck. The engine coughed once and quit. Complete fuel exhaustion. Maintenance crews tried to restart the engine to taxi the aircraft clear of the landing area. It wouldn't start. The tanks were completely dry. They had to manually disconnect the tailhook from the arresting wire and push the Hellcat clear of the landing zone by hand. When maintenance crews examined the aircraft, they made a remarkable discovery. All 6 50-caliber machine guns were jammed. Overheating from sustained use had caused mechanical failures. The last 6 rounds in the ammunition belts were stuck in the feed mechanisms. If McCampbell had encountered one more enemy aircraft, he would have had no functioning weapons. The Battle of Leyte Gulf would prove to be the largest naval engagement in history. Over 200,000 personnel were involved. Hundreds of ships engaged across 4 separate actions over 3 days. American carrier air power played a decisive role. The Hellcat squadrons maintained air superiority throughout the battle, protecting the invasion fleet from Japanese aerial attacks while striking at Japanese surface forces. McCampbell's performance on October 24th set an American record that still stands. 9 aerial victories in a single mission. No other American pilot ever matched it. For this action, combined with his 7 victories during the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot in June, McCampbell received the Medal of Honor. Rushing received the Navy Cross. But McCampbell's achievement was not merely individual heroism. It demonstrated what properly trained pilots could accomplish with the Hellcat's firepower. The aircraft provided the weapons platform, the 650s provided the firepower, the tactics provided the method, the training provided the skill. Combined, these elements produced results that Japanese planners had never anticipated. Air Group 15, under McCampbell's command, established records that would never be broken. 312 enemy aircraft destroyed in air combat, 348 destroyed on the ground. 26 pilots became aces during the deployment. The group sank more enemy ships than any other air group in the Pacific Theater. One battleship, the Musashi, was the largest battleship ever built. 3 aircraft carriers, 9 cruisers, 19 destroyers, nearly 300,000 tons of enemy shipping. These achievements reflected the systematic application of overwhelming firepower. Every pilot in the group flew Hellcats. Every Hellcat carried 650s. Every pilot had been trained in the same tactics, the same gunnery principles, the same ammunition discipline. The results were not random. They were the inevitable outcome of superior equipment, superior training, and superior tactical doctrine applied consistently across an entire air group. The Japanese response to Hellcat dominance revealed the impossibility of their strategic situation. By late 1944, Japanese aircraft designers had begun developing new fighters intended to counter the Hellcat. The Kawanishi N-1KJ Shiden, Allied codename George, was heavily armed and more heavily armoured than the Zero. The Mitsubishi J-2M Raiden, Allied codename Jack, featured better high-altitude performance. Both aircraft were superior to the Zero in addressing its vulnerabilities. But these aircraft entered service too late and in too few numbers. Japanese industry could not produce them in quantity. The factories lacked materials, skilled workers, and consistent electrical power due to American bombing. More critically, There weren't enough experienced pilots to fly these superior aircraft effectively. The new planes were handed to replacement pilots with minimal training, who died in them just as quickly as they had died in Zeros. The kamikaze tactic emerged directly from the impossibility of conventional aerial combat against Hellcats. When Admiral Takejiro Onishi proposed using aircraft as guided missiles in October 1944, his reasoning was brutally logical. Japanese pilots could not defeat American fighters in conventional combat. The skill gap was too wide, the equipment gap was too wide. But a pilot didn't need skill to crash his aircraft into a ship. He just needed determination and enough fuel to reach the target. The first organized kamikaze attacks occurred during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Zeros, loaded with explosives, dove into American ships. Some were shot down by anti-aircraft fire. Some were destroyed by Hellcat patrols before reaching the fleet, but some got through. USS Street. Lowe, an escort carrier, was sunk by a kamikaze on October 25th. It was the first major American warship sunk by this tactic. From that point until the end of the war, kamikazes became Japan's primary aerial tactic. Conventional attacks had proven futile. The mathematics were inescapable. Send 20 aircraft to attack an American task force. 15 would be shot down by Hellcat patrols before reaching the fleet. 3 more would be destroyed by anti-aircraft fire. Perhaps 2 would successfully attack and perhaps damage a ship. 20 aircraft, mostly piloted by barely trained replacements, to achieve minimal damage. Or, send 20 kamikazes. Accept that all 20 pilots will die, but perhaps 5 or 6 will reach targets and cause significant damage. The calculus was terrible, but from the Japanese perspective, rational. When conventional tactics produce only death with no results, suicide tactics that produce death with possible results become strategically logical. The Hellcats' firepower made this evolution inevitable. 6 50-caliber machine guns could destroy an aircraft in seconds. A properly positioned Hellcat pilot could engage multiple targets in a single combat. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot had demonstrated this capability on a fleet-wide scale. Hundreds of Japanese aircraft destroyed in a single day. Most shot down by Hellcats using exactly the same tactics and firepower that McCampbell employed. The broader strategic implications were profound. Air superiority enabled everything else, with Hellcats controlling the skies. American dive bombers and torpedo planes could attack Japanese ships with relative impunity. Amphibious landings proceeded without fear of aerial attack. Supply convoys crossed the Pacific safely. The island-hopping campaign that brought American forces progressively closer to Japan relied fundamentally on carrier air power, which meant Hellcat dominance. Japanese planners had bet on the Zero's superiority, providing time to fortify defensive positions and make the Pacific campaign too costly for America to sustain. They assumed American aircraft would remain inferior. They assumed American pilots would not adapt quickly. They assumed industrial production would not matter if individual aircraft quality was sufficient. All 3 assumptions proved catastrophically wrong. American aircraft became superior through systematic design improvements. American pilots adapted within months through innovative tactics and intensive training. And American industrial production overwhelmed Japanese capacity so completely that by 1944, Japanese aircraft factories could not produce enough planes to replace combat losses. The Hellcat represented the physical embodiment of American strategic advantages. Overwhelming industrial capacity produced 12,272 Hellcats between 1943 and 1945, mass production from a single factory complex on Long Island. Grumman's workforce expanded from a few thousand to over 25,000 workers. The assembly line produced aircraft so quickly that delivery became the bottleneck, not manufacturing. Each Hellcat required approximately 6,500 man-hours to build. Skilled workers, many of them women who had replaced male workers drafted into military service, assembled the complex aircraft with remarkable consistency. Quality control was rigorous. Every aircraft was test-flown before delivery to ensure it met specifications. The rejection rate was low, testimony to the skill of the workforce and the robustness of the design. The 650 caliber machine guns in each aircraft represented another industrial achievement. Browning's factories produced the M2 variants by the tens of thousands. The ammunition, 50 BMG cartridges, were manufactured by the hundreds of millions of rounds. Winchester, Remington, Lake City, Army Ammunition Plant, and other facilities ran 24-hour shifts producing the enormous quantities required. Consider the scale. 12,000 Hellcats, each carrying 6 guns, 72,000 machine guns installed. Each gun fed 400 rounds for combat missions. 28,800,000 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition carried into combat by Hellcats alone. This calculation didn't include ammunition used for training, testing, or loaded on other aircraft types. Japan could not match this production. Their entire small arms ammunition production for 1944 totaled approximately 1 billion rounds across all calibers for all purposes. American production exceeded 3 billion rounds of 50 caliber alone before counting other ammunition types. The industrial gap was not merely significant, it was civilizational. The ammunition difference affected combat directly. American pilots knew their ammunition supply was effectively unlimited. If they expended their load, they landed, rearmed, and launched again. In a single day of intense combat, a pilot might fly 3 or 4 missions, expending 1,000 rounds or more in total. The supply system always provided more. Japanese pilots knew their ammunition was precious. The 20mm cannon shells particularly were in short supply. Conservation was mandatory. This created psychological pressure during combat. An American pilot could fire a burst to test range and deflection. If he missed, he had 1,500 rounds remaining. A Japanese pilot firing his 60 cannon shells conservatively might get 12 15 bursts total. Each burst had to count. This disparity compounded tactical disadvantages. The Hellcat pilot could afford to fire longer bursts, could engage at longer ranges, could spray fire across a target area knowing that sufficient ammunition remained for additional engagements. The Zero pilot had to hold fire until close range, had to be certain of his shot, had to conserve ammunition for the entire mission because there might be no opportunity to return to base and rearm. The training pipeline differences magnified these equipment advantages. Naval Air Station, Jacksonville, Pensacola, Corpus Christi, and other training facilities graduate thousands of qualified pilots annually. The training program lasted approximately 1 year and included over 300 hours of flight time. Students learned basic flight, instrument flying, formation tactics, gunnery, navigation, and carrier operations before ever seeing combat. Gunnery training was extensive. Students fired at towed targets, at ground targets during strafing runs, at simulated aerial targets. They learned deflection shooting, the complex skill of aiming ahead of a moving target to account for bullet travel time. They practiced until their hit percentages reached acceptable standards. Only then were they certified as combat-ready. Japanese training, by contrast, collapsed under resource constraints. In 1941 and early 1942, Japanese naval aviators received training comparable to American pilots. But as experienced instructors were killed in combat and fuel became scarce, training quality declined precipitously. By 1944, replacement pilots received as little as 100 hours of total flight time before deployment. Gunnery training was minimal. Tactical training was abbreviated. These barely trained replacement pilots flew into combat against American veterans with hundreds of combat hours and thousands of rounds of gunnery practice. The outcome was predetermined. The replacement pilot might have courage and determination, but he lacked the skill to survive his first engagement against an experienced Hellcat pilot who knew exactly how to position for an attack, exactly how much lead to give at 400 feet, and exactly where to aim for maximum damage. The kill-to-loss ratio reflected these compounding advantages. Hellcat pilots achieved approximately a 19-to-1 kill ratio against Japanese aircraft throughout the war. For every Hellcat lost in air-to-air combat, 19 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. Some historians suggest this ratio partly reflects facing increasingly inferior opposition, which is accurate. But the Hellcat's design ensured it could capitalize on every advantage. 5,156 aerial victories. 305 Hellcat pilots became aces, meaning they scored 5 or more confirmed kills. The aircraft accounted for 75% of all aerial victories by United States Navy and Marine Corps pilots in the Pacific Theater. No other aircraft came close to this dominance. The comparison with other fighters is instructive. The P-51 Mustang, perhaps the most celebrated American fighter of the war, achieved 4,950 aerial victories in Europe, plus 4,000 destroyed on the ground. The Mustang was faster, had longer range, and operated in a more target-rich environment. Yet the Hellcat matched or exceeded its aerial victory total while operating exclusively from carriers in the Pacific. The Corsair, which eventually joined the Hellcat as a fleet carrier fighter, achieved 2,140 aerial victories. Excellent performance, but less than half the Hellcat's total. The difference was partly timing. The Hellcat entered carrier service earlier, but also reflected the Hellcat's better suitability for carrier operations and its more forgiving flight characteristics that allowed less experienced pilots to achieve success. The British Royal Navy operated Hellcats under the name Gannet initially, later standardized as Hellcat. 1,177 Hellcats were delivered to the Fleet Air Arm. British pilots flew them off Norway, in the Mediterranean and in the Indian Ocean. The Royal Navy Hellcats did not achieve kill ratios comparable to American units, partly because they faced less intense opposition, but British pilots universally praised the aircraft's ruggedness and firepower. One British pilot's assessment captured the Hellcat's essence: reliable, tough, and lethal. Not the fastest aircraft, not the most maneuverable, but absolutely dependable and capable of absorbing battle damage that would destroy lighter aircraft. The 650s provided firepower that compensated for any deficiency in performance. Point the nose at the enemy, press the trigger, watch them burn. The Hellcat's service extended beyond World War II. Night fighter variants equipped with radar continued operating into the early 1950s with reserve units. The F6F Newtons carried APS-6 radar in a pod mounted on the starboard wing, enabling night intercepts of Japanese aircraft. These night fighters achieved moderate success, limited more by radar technology than aircraft capability. Photo reconnaissance variants, designated F6F5P, carried cameras instead of some armament and performed vital intelligence gathering missions. These aircraft photographed Japanese installations, beaches for amphibious landings, and bomb damage assessment. The Hellcat's range and survivability made it excellent for reconnaissance work, where the aircraft might encounter enemy fighters while conducting photography missions. After the war, surplus Hellcats served various purposes. Some were converted to radio-controlled drones for weapons testing. Others were sold to foreign air forces. France operated Hellcats from carriers into the 1950s. Uruguay, Argentina, and other nations acquired small numbers for their naval aviation units. But by the mid-1950s, the jet age had rendered propeller-driven fighters obsolete for frontline service. The final U.S. Navy Hellcat was retired from reserve service in 1954. The aircraft that had dominated Pacific skies for 2 years became a museum piece, a symbol of a particular moment in aviation history when piston engines reached their apex before jets replaced them entirely. Today, surviving Hellcats are rare. Of 12,272 built, fewer than 50 remain. Most were scrapped after the war, the aluminum recycled for post-war production. A few survive in museums, carefully restored and maintained as examples of the aircraft that won the Pacific Air War. The National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida, displays McCampbell's Mincy III, or a carefully researched replica painted in its colors with the 34 rising sun flags representing his victories. The National Air and Space Museum preserves another example. Private collectors and aviation museums worldwide maintain a handful of others, some in flying condition, most as static displays. These surviving aircraft represent more than historical artifacts. They embody the philosophy that created them: rugged construction over lightweight performance, pilot protection over maximum speed, overwhelming firepower over ammunition conservation, long-term sustainability over short-term advantage. The lessons learned from Hellcat operations influenced post-war American fighter design. The F-8F Bearcat, intended as the Hellcat's replacement, combined lighter weight with even more powerful engines, but it arrived too late for World War II combat. Jets were already demonstrating the future of fighter aviation. The F-9F Panther, America's first successful carrier-based jet fighter, flew in 1947 and entered service in 1949. Yet even the early jets carried the Hellcats, DNA, multiple machine guns or cannons for maximum firepower, armor protection for the pilot, robust construction to survive combat damage. The philosophical approach established by the Hellcat persisted into the jet age and beyond. Modern American fighters, the F-15, F-16, F-A-18, F-22, continue the tradition. Overwhelming firepower through multiple weapons systems, pilot protection through advanced ejection seats and armor, rugged construction to survive battle damage and continue fighting. The specific technologies evolved from 50 caliber machine guns to 20mm cannons to missiles to beyond visual range radar-guided weapons. But the underlying philosophy remained constant. American fighters prioritize pilot survival and overwhelming firepower. Post-war analysis of Japanese aviation revealed systemic failures that went beyond aircraft design. The entire strategic approach, emphasizing short-term tactical terms, effectiveness over long-term sustainability, proved catastrophic when the war extended beyond initial projections. Jiro Horikoshi, the Zero's designer, wrote in his post-war memoir that the lack of armor and self-sealing tanks was intentional based on specifications that did not include these features. He acknowledged that only after wholesale attrition of pilots did military leadership recognize that living to fight another day was more important than achieving maximum performance in a single engagement. This admission captured the fundamental lesson. Aircraft design reflects strategic assumptions. The Zero assumed a short war, pilot superiority, and offense as the primary consideration. The Hellcat assumed a long war, industrial advantage, and pilot survival as essential to sustained operations. When those assumptions were tested by 4 years of brutal combat, the Hellcat's approach proved superior in every measurable way. The 650 caliber machine guns were not merely weapons, they were symbols of American industrial might, tactical innovation, and strategic thinking. Each gun represented thousands of hours of design work by John Browning and his successors. Each gun required specialized manufacturing using precision machinery. Each gun was fed by ammunition produced in vast quantities by factories running continuously. The fact that American industry could produce 72,000 of these guns for Hellcats alone, plus hundreds of thousands more for other aircraft, vehicles, and applications, demonstrated capabilities that Japan could never match. The visible result was Hellcat pilots firing 3-second bursts that shredded Japanese aircraft. The invisible reality was an industrial system that could sustain that level of firepower across thousands of aircraft for years of continuous combat. Japanese pilots never expected this. They expected American aircraft to be inferior, as they had been in 1941. They expected American pilots to be less skilled, as they had been early in the war. They expected that their Zero's superior maneuverability would continue to dominate. All three expectations were proven wrong by mid-1943, and catastrophically wrong by mid-1944. The Hellcats' arrival marked the turning point. From the moment F-6F squadrons entered combat in September 1943, the trajectory of the Pacific Air War was determined. Japanese air power would be systematically destroyed, not through any single dramatic battle, though there were many, not through individual heroics, though there were plenty, but through the grinding application of superior equipment, superior training, superior tactics, and superior firepower. 3-second bursts, 80 rounds per second, 650s firing simultaneously, 240 rounds downrange, into unprotected fuel tanks, into thin aluminum skin, into aircraft designed for an entirely different type of war. The results were inevitable, predictable, and ultimately decisive. By August 1945, when Japan surrendered, the Imperial Japanese Navy's aviation arm had been effectively destroyed. The few remaining experienced pilots had no aircraft to fly. The few remaining aircraft had no qualified pilots. The training pipeline had collapsed, industrial production had ceased, and American Hellcats, along with Corsairs and other late-war fighters, controlled Pacific skies completely. The 650 caliber machine guns had done their work, not elegantly, not efficiently in terms of rounds expended per kill, but overwhelmingly, decisively, and finally. The firepower that Japanese pilots never expected to be so devastating had shredded not just aircraft, but an entire strategic approach to warfare. In the final analysis, the Hellcat story is not primarily about mechanical engineering or aerodynamics. It is about philosophy, choice, and consequence. Choose to prioritize offense over defense. Accept the consequences when the war lasts longer than projected. Choose to build lightweight aircraft that prioritize performance. Accept the consequences when facing heavy-caliber weapons. Choose to minimize pilot protection to save weight, and accept the consequences in pilot casualties. The Americans chose differently. They chose rugged construction, even if it meant lower performance. They chose pilot protection, even if it meant added weight. They chose overwhelming firepower, even if it meant complex installation and ammunition logistics. And they chose to build 12,000 Hellcats to ensure that numerical superiority supplemented qualitative advantages. These choices, made in engineering offices and strategic planning sessions, were validated in combat over the Philippine Sea, over Leyte Gulf, over Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Every engagement confirmed that the Hellcat 650s, properly employed by trained pilots using proven tactics, could destroy any Japanese aircraft in seconds. 3-second bursts became the signature of Pacific air combat. Short, disciplined, lethal, the visible tracers converging, the invisible armor-piercing rounds punching through unprotected structure, the incendiary compounds igniting fuel vapor, the explosion that ended another Japanese aircraft and another Japanese pilot. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.